You've learned a lot about the different types, variables, how to use them, how to use arrays, and how the basics of the JavaScript language work. You also had a look at objects and these reference types which objects seem to be. Now in this module I'll focus on objects, which means I'll explain what objects actually are, how you create them, and some, well, characteristics objects in JavaScript have. Let's dive into this. Let's start with the creation of objects. I already showed one way. I can create an object by simply creating a variable, and the value which I create is, well, an object with opening and closing curly braces, and then between those curly braces I define the object. Now I was already talking about fields and methods or functions inside this object, and I want to show this in more detail here. So I'll not name this object, I'll name this person to make this a bit more realistic. And let's say this person has a name, and I'm just picking my name here, but you may enter your name, of course. Important, when creating an object, you're not writing name equals, but instead name colon, at least when using this notation, and I'll show other notations soon. This is the JavaScript object notation, a literal notation, where you have this very convenient way of creating objects, just like this in code with curly braces. So then you have your variable here, or your field name, colon, and then the value. And of course you might have multiples, like the h2, which in this case will be a number. You can then, of course, log the complete object like this, and you'll see it here. Or you can just access certain variables or properties of this object by writing person.name, for example. If I run this, I just see max because I'm now only accessing this property here. Another way to access this property is to use this array-like notation with squared brackets, and then here you pass the field you want to access, for example name again, as a string. So name, name. Now if I run this, I still get max. However, accessing properties like this is not how you should do this by default. This is more useful if you would have, say, another variable, which I name field, and this would be a string of name, and let's say this variable would be dynamically derived from within your code. Then you could pass this variable here, like we were passing the index I in a for loop when accessing the different fields or elements in an array, for example. So here I'm passing this variable, which of course is this string. And now I'm outputting the name too. Now why is this better? Well, it's better because this might be the only way you get this field name in your code when, again, this is dynamically created. If you know which field you want to access when writing the code, always use the dot notation here to access this property, like so. So this is how you can access properties. Now, what kind of properties can you have? You see we got name and age here. You also can have objects as properties. So I can create another object within this object. So details might be hobbies, which then might be an array with sports, cooking, whatever. And let's say another property of this nested object with my location, Germany. Now I could print out details.hobbies, and let's see what shows up if I hit run. I see sports and cooking. So now I can access this nested object just by chaining the properties here with dot notation. And this is very important to understand. Your object can hold all the types you could also assign to variables. You can think of these properties as variables just inside an object. This is why we have this colon here and no equal sign, because we're inside an object. But besides that, you can have the same things. You can of course also have a function in here. Though you wouldn't write it like this, but you would write greet, for example, if this should be the greet function, still a colon, and then function console log hello. And I could call this function like so, person greet. Don't forget the parentheses here. If I execute this code, you see hello, of course. Now, using this notation looks like this notation when creating function outside of objects, and it's very comparable, only the equal sign got replaced. So that's the general idea you should follow when creating objects, or you may think of objects. You have key value pairs for everything, including functions. You always have that key, and then the value may be whichever value you could also assign to variables. This is how you can think and should think of objects. And what is the advantage of such an object? Well, you can depict many things much better with an object. Let's say your application indeed works with persons. It allows a user to enter some data about himself, and then you want to use that in your JavaScript application. Now, you could create a variable for the name, for the last name, and so on, or you group it all together in one object, which makes much more sense since you're probably going to use that object throughout your code anyways. So this is where objects really shine. And of course they are reference types as explained earlier, which means you can use one object in multiple variables, and if you change it in one place, the rest will be updated too. And that's not necessarily a bad behavior. This would allow you to make sure you keep a certain object in sync, so you make sure you always have the same state throughout your application. So if I now try something else and I log the type of person, this of course should be straightforward and should give us an object. What if I log the type of person name? What do you think will show up now? Well, we get a string. So this is a normal string value. It has nothing to do with an object. It's just a property inside an object, but the value is string or number or object in this case, or function in this case, like it would be the case outside of an object. There's also one addition I want to make here, or one important thing to understand and know. Until now we always use property names like this, and this is perfectly fine. However, there's also one other way. You may use strings as your property names, like this, age, name, and so on. And one advantage this yields is that now you're also able to use, for example, a dash in the name, like let's say first dash name, which otherwise would give you an error. You're not allowed to have, like, let's say the first details with a dash. If you run this, you'll get an error, but if I run it without the first details, you'll see it'll work fine because, well, I no longer have name here, but this is a string. So this was one advantage. You may use names, property names, which you would not be able to use otherwise. And you might also need this if you're dynamically creating your property names, for example. Then this might be another use case. So that's important to know that property names can be both like variables here, so just plain text, or a string. Now, if you want to print such a string property name, of course you can't use this, because if I hit run now, it gives me an error because, well, first it's now trying to do a subtraction here, so that's not working. So here you will need to use the squared bracket syntax and then access it as a string, so first name. If I now hit run, you see Max. So this is how you access your string property names and how you set them. And that's just an important addition to have at this point to understand how you can set up your objects.